Welcome to the special lecture Symbolic Expression, and in the studio we have Manisha Sharma with us as sign language expert, and the topic of today's discussion is the portrayal of Indian values in Hindi cinema. And as we know that cinema of different countries, they try to portray their own stories in that sense, and the kind of socio-economic, political, cultural milieu which is there in that particular region is being reflected in that particular cinema. So, in that sense, when we talk about Hindi cinema also tries to portray the Indian values which are there in that, and India also has a number of regional cinemas in different kinds of languages, and they also try to portray those kinds of values in that sense which are there in India. And many of the critics, they may argue that there cannot be one Indian values because how India is being divided into so many regions, etc. But that's one side of the story. But at the same time, when you talk about unity in diversity, when you talk about so many aspects which are there in the Indian society and culture, and how they get reflected in the various kinds of cinemas which are there. And in that context, when we talk about when cinema originated and how during that particular time, that was also the period of the national movement as well. So, we find that many of the values which were associated with the national movement, they got reflected in the Hindi films, and how cinema and the national movement, they in a way interacted with each other. And many times we find that the values of the national movement, they got reflected in the films. And thereafter, when India became independent in 1947, and thereafter the ideals of nation building, they also got reflected in many of the films which were made during that particular period, 50s and 60s. So, in a way, when you talk about these kinds of values which are there in the society and how they get reflected in the cinema of that particular period, they in a way tend to highlight the kind of contemporary ideas which are prevalent and how society in a way adapts to these kinds of ideas. And in the context of the Indian cinema, we find that how during the time it emerged, it was a period of the freedom struggle, as I told you, and at the same time these kinds of nationalist aspirations or the motives, they got reflected in cinema. And we also see in the context of values, the love, compassion, family commitment, loyalty, all these kinds of values, they are cherished across societies, and they are also evident in the literature of that particular period. Many a times we see that how the ideas of identity, culture, fashion, they also get reflected in films. And when you talk about the Indian knowledge traditions, ethics and the human values, then they can be seen in the films as well. And the idea of Sarv Dharm Sambhav, as it is being talked about, can also be seen in the films as well. And we know that how during the silent era, Dada Saheb Phalke's film Raja Harishchandra, which is considered to be the first feature film of that time, and from 1913 to 1931 we find the silent cinema. And during this particular period, we find that how a number of films which were religious, they were being made, and they also tend to convey the ideas of deities, demons and the supernatural powers as well. And when films which were made on these kind of religious devotional themes, we find that in later times as well, some of the television serials which were taken from Ramayana and Mahabharata in 1980s and early 1990s, how these actors, they were being venerated by the audience as well, because they considered them to be real. And we find that apart from the religious theme, we also see that devotionals like Tulsidas, Surdas, Tukaram, all these kinds of films, they were also being made, and they were being endowed with the power to perform the miracles, and their lives and teachings, they influenced the masses, and they were held in great reverence as well. And we find that how film audience was had this kind of an infatuation with these kinds of ideas, and they wanted to believe in the gods and goddesses which were there. They wanted to in a way worship them, and they had the faith in the divinity of divinity for performing the miracles as well. And so that was one reason because of which the religious and the devotional themes, they became popular at this point of time. And we also see that there was also a fear of the loss of the capital among the producers, and they did not want to venture into other themes which might be political in nature. And we also see during this time that how the censorship authority or the machinery of the British did not want that any kinds of themes which were related to the national movement, which were revolutionary in nature or which were democratic, they should not be shown to the audience, because they did not want that such kind of themes they should reach the masses. And it was also in a way linked to the growing national consciousness as well, because India was under the colonial rule, and these kinds of legends of gods and goddesses, they provided an oblique information of the national sentiments against the threatened domination of an alien culture. So, how British culture, it wanted to dominate the Indian culture, how they wanted to create a hegemony in the sphere of culture by telling the Indians that English was the language which was to be learnt, and the Indian languages, they were not qualified enough, they were not they were not important in that sense. And similarly, the literature of West, the knowledge of the West was in a way communicated to be superior in nature, and Indian cultural as well as educational traditions, they were considered to be backward in nature. So, such kind of things, they were being done by the British deliberately to in a way position themselves as being superior beings. And when one talks about the initial films, Raja Harishchandra, for example, it held a parallel to the philosophy of Satyagraha, that how one has to endure suffering with faith in the ultimate victory of good over evil. And in the fight against the colonial rule, it was also needed that no, you not only needed courage, but also selfless sacrifice was also needed to fight the British as well. So, such kind of ideas, they were relevant at that point of time, and they were also being communicated to the audience through various films which were made during this time. And that was also the period, as I told you, of the national movement, where we find that how Mahatma Gandhi was in a way trying to lead the movement through non-violent means, and his weapons of truth and non-violence, they were also being promoted by cinema at that point of time. And we also see that when the kind of atmosphere which existed was related to anti-imperialism, and how these films, they were the symbolic representations of the struggle against tyranny. And one of the film journalist, K. Abbas, who was with Bombay Chronicle, and later he also delved into films as well, he says that the films of that particular period, one of them related to Lord Krishna, and how Lord Krishna's struggle against tyrant Kans could strike a patriotic note of defiance in the heart of cinegoers. And when Lord Krishna was talking about bad judgment, misrule, oppression, and the tyranny of Kans, it was also suggestive of the colonial oppression and misrule as well. Another important thing which we noticed during this time, that how women, they were allowed to go to theaters, so that they could watch these films which would be good from the point of view of the themes as they related to the religious themes. And we also find that when the news topicals which were accompanying these bhakti films, they were being where the leaders of the Congress and other bodies, they were being shown that how they were participating in the freedom movement. This kind of a message was debated at home as well. And we also find that such kind of films, they also in a way try to create an impact on women, and how women, when they went to see such films, they were also they became aware about what was happening in the political sphere as well, when such kind of news topicals, they were being shown to them. And we see that when such kind of films, when they came, for example, when you talk about Sikandar, it was in a way its release coincided with the Second World War, and the atmosphere was tense. And we find that was also the period of the Quit India movement. And when Porus was talking about driving out the outsiders out of Bharatvarsh, then such kind of references could also be related with the British as well, that how Indians they wanted to drive out the British. And when one is talking about the films which were the stunt films, we find that they had deeper nationalist overtones, they were patriotic in nature, and they advocated democracy. And in those films, the climax scenes, we see some kind of a verbal confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist, and the ideas of right of democracy, good governance, justice and freedom of speech and expression, they were being advocated in these films. And in the climax we will find that how the victory of good over evil and legitimate over illegitimate will also take place, and it in a way sharpened the people's desire for freedom as well. So we find that such kind of cinema which was based on religious themes, which was talking about the devotional aspects, and even many times we find the crude stunt films as well, and these crude stunt films they carried a lot of meaning. And as it was discussed earlier as well, that how the stunt cinema it also contributed, where we find that people like JBH Wadia and Homi Wadia and film heroine Nadia, who was known as Nadia, but whose original name was Mary Evans, all of them they contributed to the popularity of this genre. And many of these filmmakers they also in a way recognized in later times that how they wanted to portray such kind of characters on the screen. They were very well aware about the national movement and how they could contribute to the national movement as well. So such kind of films definitely we find they were able to portray and glorify the democratic aspirations of the masses, and the scholars like Abbas they have definitely talked about these kinds of aspects. And we also find that when British censors they were also satisfied at the climax by installation of a legitimate heir on throne, and the audience could not forget the earlier sequences which were dramatizing the general public defiance of a tyrant's authority. So in that sense also we realize that such kind of films or picturizations which were dealing with the varied kind of themes, including the stunts, and stunts they have been in a way criticized on the ground of being crude, but these films they were also trying to communicate the ideals of the nationalist values and the ideals where they had to fight the colonial rulers. So such kind of picturizations definitely helped the people those who were associated with the film industry in that sense, and also the audience as well, because the audience was able to identify with them, and they in a way later realized, for example, Wadia, JBH Wadia in a way talks about this kind of an idea where he was trying to promote and propagate the ideas of democracy and freedom. And we also realized that apart from these kinds of things, there were other important themes of his films, for example, untouchability, literacy campaign and the dignity of labor, plea for democracy, anti-fascism and emancipation of Indian women. So we find that these kinds of themes they were in a way universal in nature, in that sense that how untouchability was to be removed from the society, it was considered to be an evil, and literacy again was an important concern, that how people they had to be made literate, and on the other hand the issue of the dignity of labor, that how the labor was to be seen in that particular framework. And we also realize that India was under the colonial rule. So for that matter we find that democratic aspirations where India had to become free they were there, and the ideas of anti-fascism during that particular period, in the sense that Nazism and fascism they had established themselves in Italy and Germany, and any such kind of an attempt where India was to be dominated by such kind of tendencies, they were being negated. And the emancipation of Indian women was another important concern of that particular period, because of the sense because of the reason that how women they had not only participated in the national movement, but the socio religious reform movement leaders they talked about the idea of the emancipation women, and they made all out efforts in that sense, so that women come out of that kind of a situation, and any kind of any issues which were there with regard to women, they could be taken care of. We also realized that apart from the films which were based on the theme of stunt or action films of today, we find that many of the film studios or film companies, the way they were being named also were trying to reflect the nationalist aspirations. For example, banners like Hindu Mata Films, Jawahar Movie Tone, or National Movie Tone. So, all these kinds of film studios and companies, they were trying to convey their aspirations as well, that they wanted to adhere to the national movement. And even some of the films, the way they were being titled, for example, Baghi Sipahi, for that matter, that how soldiers, they had to rebel in this kind of a situation. So, all of them definitely contributed at that point of time, and we also realized that apart from the genre of the religious cinema, the devotional films, the stunt films, we also see that there were socials as well, which were talking about various kinds of aspects relating to the Hindu Muslim unity or the caste system or mismatched marriages. And we find that some of the films like Reth, which was made in 1931, it was dealing with the issue of poverty, untouchability and social inequality, and it had a character called Garib Das, who was drawn in exact image of Gandhi. And such kind of films, they were heavily cut by the censorship authorities, and this particular film as well was renamed as Khuda Ki Shan, or the glory of God. So, when we tend to understand that how the censors, they were functioning at that point of time, when we also see that the issues of Hindu Muslim unity, they were central at that point of time, because both of them, they were fighting the national movement, and it was also evident in the non-cooperation movement of Mahatma Gandhi, and how films like Achut Kanya, for that matter, or Achut in 1940, they were also making some kind of a plea for removal of untouchability as well. And we also realized that the issue of mismatched marriages was taken up in Duniya Na Mane, which was made by V. Shantaram in 1937. And how Gandhi, who did not like cinema, because Gandhi was critical of cinema, was in a way shown in films, not only in the documentaries which were made on Gandhi, but at the same time a number of films, they were also in a way trying to copy the character of Gandhi. As I told you, Reth, which was a film where we find that the character was drawn in exact image of Gandhi. So, such kind of portrayals definitely played an important role in that sense, and how the censorship authorities, they were aware about such kind of depictions, portrayals and picturizations, and they cut the scenes and they renamed the films as well. And that was not the only film which was being in a way censored by the censorship authority, but there were so many others as well, because they saw that anything which was considered to be revolutionary in nature, anything which was showing the democratic aspirations. So, such a kind of a cinema was to be in a way such kind of scenes which were talking about these kinds of aspects, they were to be removed by the censorship authorities. And and we find that these kind of genres, they were also relevant from the social point of view, because of the fact that when such kind of picturizations, they were being shown to the masses, they also realized that they had to be in a way removed from the society. And in that sense, as I told you, Achut Kanya was a film which was made in 1936, and how it was showing the contemporary awareness of untouchability in the intercaste barriers which existed in the society, and how the national movement leaders like Gandhi, they were saying that untouchability during this time was a scourge, and the colonial rule as a scourge and untouchability as a plague. So, during the colonial period, such kind of tendencies which were there, which have been criticized as well, and we find that V. Shantaram's contribution in this regard has been immense, because he made a number of films which were dealing with these kinds of aspects, and he talked about the varied kinds of issues which were of social relevance, which were talking about the issues of social awareness and how they could also in a way reform the society as well. So, in the discussion in the discussion which we had with regard to the Indian values, we also realized that these kinds of value systems, they also emanated from the society as well, and how these kinds of issues which were there in the society, they were being talked about among the masses as well, how they were being portrayed in the cinema as well, that cinema realized that they had to in a way portray such kind of ideas which are favorable to the Indian nation as well. And as I told you that there was a film called Duniya Na Mane, which was made in 1937 by V. Shantaram, which was dealing with the mismatched marriages in the society, and the female protagonist Shanta Apte exhibits revolutionary reform spirit of a woman, and she realizes that the emancipation of women, they lied in their own hands, and she makes a lot of efforts to overcome her problems as well, and finally she also refuses to consummate her marriage as well. So, this film was considered to be one of the films which was much ahead of its time in the context of the framework, in the idea, in the theme which was being taken up, and the kind of treatment which was being given to this particular film. And as I told you, V. Shantaram definitely contributed through such kind of picturizations, where he not only made this particular film, but he also made Admi again, which we will talk about in detail. And we find that such kind of picturizations definitely in a way help the society in the context that they wanted to create, bring about a lot of changes in the society. So, we will talk about further about these aspects in the next lecture. Thank you very much.